Hello, Delco people.
Morning.
Stephen, this is an important conversation this week. The subject of this video, earlier today, you had a Spider-Man shirt on. I have a characterization of John Wesley, the modern day founder of the Methodist movement. And the obvious question and the reason this video is being made is who would win in a fight, John Wesley or Spider-Man?
I think that's a very good question. I think we
Yeah.
should put our sermon aside and talk about that.
Yeah.
That can be our Sunday topic of conversation.
Okay, you'd probably rather listen to that conversation, but this is actually week 5 of our series in Ecclesiastes. We have walked through work. Does it have meaning? We've walked through money. We've walked through wisdom. We've walked through the cycles of life. And now we're at the best possible theme. Nothing can become any more interesting than relationships. The question Ecclesiastes poses: do relationships, do people have meaning? Stephen, you have relationships.
I do have a few.
Yeah. Some people, I feel like many people have pointed to you as a great maker and keeper of relationships, a great people person. Would you say you agree with that? I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this.
Do I agree that I hear people say that about me? I think I've heard people say that about me, but I think I don't know how much more what else to comment on about that.
Yeah. That's a good point. You are terrible with people. That's what I was trying to get at, is all those people are wrong. You're terrible with them.
Well, I'll be a good case study for this.
But the good news is so am I. And so that's why we need this time talking about relationships in Ecclesiastes. But no, we are talking about relationships. We're talking about companionship, which is kind of more of the nuance of the words that Ecclesiastes uses. But as always, we begin talking about this word that is all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It's called Hevel. That's the Jewish or the Hebrew name for it. That's the Jewish interpretation. In our Bibles, it's usually something like meaningless, but we always try to explain what is it? What is Hevel? What is this meaninglessness? So, Stephen, what are we kind of getting at when we talk about, or when the author of Ecclesiastes says like everything is meaningless, a chasing after the wind?
Yeah, if you read this book, you cannot avoid the word. It's almost like in Princess Bride. Doesn't that guy continually say inconceivable like over and over?
Inconceivable.
I could hear him just saying meaningless. Yeah, we've definitely leaned on the Bible Project for the meaning of this word Hevel, which in your Bibles is translated as meaninglessness or vanity. The Bible Project encourages us to think about this word as a smoke or vapor, and this word can be translated as that image. And the Bible Project said this image is helpful because it doesn't necessarily mean these things are bad. It doesn't mean money's bad, work's bad. I really hope companionship or friendship is not bad.
Yeah.
What they're saying is if you attempt to find your meaning, all the meaning of your life, all the purpose of your life in these things, they'll fade away just like a smoke does. Just as you cannot grab onto smoke, you cannot grab onto these things for meaning.
Totally.
So that's. Are they also, the other thing I like that they said is, like, just as if you're in the midst of a bunch of smoke, you can't see out of it. If you get consumed by these things and are standing in the midst of a life consumed by work, it's going to be really hard to see what else life could look like outside of that. So I thought that was another good way they use that metaphor.
Yeah, totally. Which is especially interesting when we're going to start talking about relationships with people. Because if there's one thing that is probably closest to our original intention, and definitely something that the church maybe has been blinded by as a whole, is definitely how do we understand people? How do we relate to one another in relationship to one another? Is probably one of the most people. I think we talk about work and money a lot, but this might be one of the most confusing, one of the most difficult to conceive how we find meaning in it and how difficult it is to see out of it. but we are gonna talk about that. But first, so Stephen, I was in Delaware, and I was walking my dog, and I saw the courthouse. It's actually very close to my apartment, and I was looking at the courthouse, and that's where I realized that sometimes relationships can be meaningless. They can be like Hevel, right? Like a courthouse often is where some marriages start, and hopefully most marriages start with a great amount of love. And then it seems like in America, especially, they take this very quick downward turn. And now they don't want to have anything to do with each other. And they have to go to do a divorce court, and they say terrible things about each other. And America has like a 60% divorce rate right now, right? So relationships started with the greatest intentions immediately sometimes like fail. And now they suddenly hate each other.
Yeah.
Here's another example. I thought about how parents who think that they want kids and they have kids or they adopt them and they try to make a life for them, but life becomes difficult and the children are taken away because of mistreatment or abuse. That happens at a courthouse. And right now we have 500,000 or more children in the foster care system, right? I was thinking about friends and family members or acquaintances and strangers who all bring lawsuits against one another in a courthouse, just trying to get like some possession or to get back at somebody or to take advantage of somebody. Like these are all things we do to one another in a courthouse. And also in a courthouse is where criminals testify either for or against their crimes and the ways that they've wronged other humans, right? Like they stole from one another and they were captured, they murdered one another. And ironically, I mean, this is a famous stat, but like 55% of people who are murdered by people they know personally. So chances are if you're going to be murdered, you already know who it's going to be. So keep an eye out. But generally, it seems like in a courthouse, there's a lot of examples of humans being treated poorly in relationship to one another. And I'm not a judge and I'm not a clerk. I'm not a lawyer. I've never even actually been in a courthouse. But I am guessing that if you spend a regular amount of time in a courthouse, you would begin to wonder if relationships have any meaning at all. That'd be my guess. And that's my guess for the author of Ecclesiastes too.
Yeah, Jesus tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, but when you look at all that, it's like, well, what's the purpose if it's going to end like all these like every example you just provided, that it is not. This feels like the most depressing opening we've had.
As I was writing it, I was like, wow, this is way more of a bummer than I thought. But it's true. We just treat each other poorly. The fact of the matter is that we are sorely tempted to find our personal meaning in the lives or well-being or harm of other people. And there's a reason for it. The reason that relationships are sometimes so hard is because we as humans were designed and created for incredible, self-giving, shame-free relationships with God and with others. And we seek that out and we want it, and we ruin it a lot of times. And it feels impossible, and it feels unfair to want something so intensely that right now in this season, in this time of creation, it's next to impossible to really have or replicate. We were made to be worshiping co-laborers and representatives of God together as a human species, as we harness the bountiful beauty of creation. And so much of that has been manipulated and wronged and made difficult. And so as we've seen in both Genesis and Ecclesiastes, that meaning is corrupted. And now as we try to find that meaning that we had in other things that aren't that, we get confused, we cause destruction, evil abounds, we choose to define good and evil for ourselves. And it's just difficult, right? Um, Here's the thing with Ecclesiastes, what it's constantly trying to get you to do is to keep noticing in yourself how, as humans, we keep being tempted to find meaning in things that are not divine, that are not full of life, that are not abundantly self-giving. And so work will destroy you, money will leave you empty, the seasons of life are impossible to understand, and wisdom is often fleeting. The thing with relationships that's hard, that I think is harder than any other thing we've talked about, Stephen, is that humans are made in God's image. Every human is, right? You, me, the mailman, every person, the convict, the president, everyone. And so by nature, humans are innately very close to the divine, right? They're just like, they're spitting images, right?
Yeah.
And so both Hebrews and the book of Psalms say that humans are higher and more glorious than even the angels, right? Which is an incredible statement. And so I love this quote from C.S. Lewis. I've thought about it a lot in terms of how close humans are to God. It is a serious thing, he says, to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship it, or be in horror because of the pure corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, would only be seen in a nightmare.
Wow.
Right? Which is just like like a really vivid picture of what humans are capable of, the greatest goods and the greatest evils. I don't know. Does that make sense to you, Stephen? Like, does that line up with your experience of life and with people?
Yeah, well, I think even one of the in the Psalms, doesn't God say, he basically says to people, you are gods, and it's playing with this. He's not literally saying we're a god,
Right.
but he's playing with this idea of the tremendous value we have made in his image. And I think you're right. If we walk in step with God's intentions, we are becoming something incredibly beautiful. And if we resist that, we are slowly becoming something very awful.
Yeah.
And I think that C.S. Lewis gets that right. If we were to see ourselves and if we were to take the eternal future of ourselves and meet them today, we'd be probably in awe or horror.
Yeah. I especially love the horror of it.
Not horror.
Yeah. Yeah, so like humans are these incredible things. Like there's so many, we lose sight of how incredible creation is. So you have that aspect, and then you have the aspect where because of our nature, humans are also designed to worship. We innately worship, which is part of that finding value, but also has to do with like the reality of what we give time and energy and attention and praise to is this worship, or literally like we get that word from worthship. We are considering something of high enough worth to orient our lives around, right? Worthship. And so throughout human history, almost always we have worshiped someone, whether it is some divinity, imaginary or not, or something with personhood or perceived personhood, right? Like this is idolatry. Like as soon as Moses goes up on the mountain and God brings down this commandment of like, don't make an image of me because I don't have an image. You are supposed to be that image. I made you in my image. What the Israelites immediately form this calf, and Aaron says, all right, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Doesn't he look cool? And they immediately start worshiping him. And God's on the mountain. They can see his presence on the mountain, and instead they are worshiping this golden calf because that is easier somehow than to worship the actual person who is Yahweh, like God. There's just something about it. And so we've got kings and queens and emperors and dictators who have all declared themselves divine. They're like, I am worthy of worship. I am connected to the gods. And people have always people have just gone with that. Be like, yeah, Julius Caesar, like he was probably divine. Like, yeah, the Pharaoh, almost certainly. Look how cool he is, I guess. I don't know what they're like. Maybe they were just told to do it. But even like in Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas, because of the work that they've done, are confused for gods. I think they're called like Zeus, and Barnabas is like Hermes or something, Greek gods. But they get confused for gods, and they get worshipped. And Paul and Barnabas immediately are like, whoa, this isn't the whole thing. We're talking about someone else. But we are humans, and we are close to the divine, and we have many divine characteristics: eternality, creativity, self-giving love. But we have this great capacity and corrupted capacity for evil, as well as good. And all of human history comes into focus when we start talking about that, because we've manipulated and abused that for thousands of years, as we keep turning away from God and saying that, what's good is to worship this human. But Stephen, I don't think it's very hard to translate this into like modern day. What do you feel like our modern day versions of our worship of humans? Can you think of like one or two that seem to like stick out?
Yeah, I kind of had like three that come to mind. I mean,
Yeah.
one, I would just say any like celebrity. I mean, remember when the Twilight books were out in high school, all the Jacob Edward camps? And so we do it from like a love perspective. We do it with sports, I think. I remember when I was in high school and college, I was tempted, like I didn't literally bow down in worship, but I was tempted to find my identity in like the girlfriends that I had.
Totally.
I think we're tempted in friendships. There's like codependency. That's that psychological word where you're so dependent upon another person for your self-worth. I think those are all ways that, in a sense, we're worshiping.
And in those moments, I'm asking you to do maybe some introspection, but what do you feel like is happening to your identity? Like, how are you finding worth in those different spheres, or how are we finding worth in those different spheres? Like, I can think of someone, even for me, so maybe there are scholars that I really respect, I listen to a lot, even scholars that are teaching me about my faith. And when I see the level of competency they have, I begin to wonder, like, oh man, can I orient my life in such a way that I can be like them, like, right? Or like have that same level of security that they have. That's how I feel like it pulls on my identity and kind of like what I put value in. Can you relate to that?
I think for sure. I mean, I think with celebrities, that one you can just, celebrities and what people you don't actually know in the flesh, you can create all sorts of fantasies and whatnot in terms of what that means to you. So I think you go a lot of different routes. In terms of people that you're living life with, like the person, the friend that you're codependent with, I mean, that's a level of depth too. There's a sense in which you feel you're not okay unless they're okay. You begin to build your life around what their expectations are for you, or maybe you attempt to build their life around what your expectations are for them.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't think we get to decide if we worship. We get to decide who we worship. And I think there's all these things that, like relationships, we're created in God's image. God is in relationship in the Trinity. We're designed for relationship, but it's crazy how even something like that we can corrupt and find our meaning in it. Like our ultimate meaning, our purpose, our identity.
No, I think that's so true. So let's pivot to, we've established this reality of like, this is not how we are called to relate to one another. This is not what we're called to find meaning in. And Ecclesiastes, I think, maybe tangentially has a ton to say about relationships, but not a ton directly. There is one passage we're going to point to and see what wisdom Ecclesiastes has for us in terms of like, what does it mean for me to relate to things that so closely resemble the divine, but are not. That we are actually, we are one and the same in that way. They are just in God's image. They point to what is worthy of worship. So we're going to talk for just a couple of minutes about Ecclesiastes 4 through 12. Stephen, would you be willing to read Ecclesiastes 4 through 12 for us?
Yes, I can. Ecclesiastes 4 through 12. Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity, or hevel, or smoke, and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hand and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again, I saw vanity, or again, meaningless, or smoke. Under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken.
Thank you, Stephen. So there's a lot going on there. I'm going to go through 2 parts fairly quickly and really focus then on 9 through 12. But basically what we see here is in 4 through 6, Ecclesiastes wants to put people in these categories of, are you part of the wicked? Are you a fool? Or are you someone that's called wise? There are these 3 categories for people. And what it's really trying to demonstrate is the path of the wicked and the path of the fool lead them to being alone, right? So we see how all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This is a very common thing in relationships where we envy one another. Envy almost always has malicious intent. It's not, I wish I had that thing. It's, I want that thing so another person can't have it, right? So this is a wicked person, someone who is choosing to define good and evil for themselves, and especially in light of attacking or taking away from another. Then you see very quickly in verse 5 that fools fold their hands, and I like eats their own flesh. My translation says ruins themselves, but yours is more literal. They communicate the same thing in terms of the fool is someone who manipulates the community around them and chooses to then extort it so that they don't have to work, so that they don't have to do anything that adds value to the community. So they choose to literally, I mean, you can't see me if you're listening to this audio, but fold their hands, close their hands, fold their arms. They are not going to work. They are just going to take advantage of the goodwill of the community around them. But that also, it says, leads them to ruin. Then in verse 6, here's the wise person. Better 1 handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. You can imagine yourself working on a project. What it's trying to say is it would be better for you to work with 1 hand so that your other hand can keep a hold of your piece than to try to work with 2 hands if it's going to drive you crazy, right? You may be able to get the project done faster, but you're going to lose part of your soul. Like, you're going to get hurt. Like, you are going to not be able to glorify the Lord in that. And I'm not saying you should literally do 2-handed projects with 1 hand, but they're casting an image that's how much better it would be, is for you to have that tranquility. If it meant going slower, having less, achieving less, it would be better for your soul and for your family, right? So the wicked, the wise, and the fool. I often feel like a fool or a wicked person. I do not often feel like a wise person. So then we have these 3 caricatures, and then we move quickly into 7 through 8, which is then a meditation or just a story about the result, which is, again, aloneness, being alone. We see the picture of what this drives this person to, is someone who has no one. He's all alone, no son, no brother, and yet he works endlessly. And he says, I'm not even toiling for anything, right? I have no enjoyment in my life. This too is meaningless and a miserable business. And I think the question that it begs is he alone and so he works so hard, or does he work so hard and therefore he is alone? And I think it's almost certainly the latter in this case.
Yep.
That
especially in Hebrew culture.
Totally. That him finding meaning in this toil and making it the center of his life, the way he orients his whole life, has caused him to be alone in his life. He has become a wicked or foolish person in this way. And it's a miserable business. So right here, then, you get to verses 9, 10, 11, and 12. And I really like these verses. They kind of come off as just like little mantras almost of like, here's some wisdom, some quick wisdom for what it means to be in relationship. And Stephen, this is interesting. This is one of the first times I think in this book that he does not declare afterwards that this part is meaningless, right? Yeah. Like he actually says two are better than one. He uses that word better. And then at the end, he doesn't say like, but even if you do all this, relationships are meaningless, right? So we have like some real wisdom here that we can finally hang on to. I feel like in this book. It's so frustrating at times. So here's kind of like 4 quick observations, actually just 3 quick observations about what Ecclesiastes seems to say about relationships, talking about how are we supposed to relate to one another. Verses 9 through 10, I think it talks about what I call like the profit of a group of one-handed people. And I mean profit like P-R-O-F-I-T, the profit of it. Because it's true, right? We saw that the fool folds his hands. To use both hands is like going to drive you crazy. But I got this cool picture of like a bunch of one-handed people doing a task together. And it says here, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor, right? So it didn't say that the fool got a good return for their labor. It didn't say that the guy who works with both hands got a good return for his labor. And it said it was a chasing after the wind and toil. But here, 2 people with one hand on their work and the other hand on tranquility somehow are getting a better return on their labor, which is super weird. I don't know always
with efficient by myself.
Do I?
I'm not more efficient by myself.
It doesn't seem that way. It seems like the task that you're trying to accomplish will actually wear you out more. And so somehow in the book of Ecclesiastes, we see that it profits us to do the work together, because it does allow us to not only accomplish the task to make the profit, but it'll actually be better than if we were doing it by ourselves. This weird one-handed group of people trying to do something together. Yeah, I know it feels weird in my head, but I think it makes sense. You've got a picture of a community or a family providing for one another in such a way that they get to preserve the meaning of their work and their internal peace. Excuse me. And then it goes on to say in verse 10, because you're together, when one of these 2 people fall, there is another one there who's going to help them up, right? There is, but the one who is alone and they fall, there is no one to help them up, right? So again, like this return on investment, this return on your labor, not only like, is it going to be easier? Are you going to get a better return? But then when you fail even, the benefit is there's going to be someone right there to help you out, like to help pick you up in a way that's meaningful. Whereas before, you might not be able to pick yourself up, right?
Or even think of the contrast of the verse 4 that says all the work that comes from envy of a neighbor. And now we have a picture of when one falls, you don't rejoice because of the envy in your heart, but you pick them up. That's a beautiful contrast.
That's really cool. I did not see that. That's really good. So 1, we come together and we have a profit, P-R-O-F-I-T. So we are talking about very meaningful, like this is good. We do get a profit in terms of working together. So then we see verse 11. Also, it says, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Right? So here we're talking about comfort. We're called to comfort one another in a meaningful way. Uh, it seems like the author is pointing to like this incompleteness or impossibility of being able to survive on your own. We see pictures in TV shows of like the grizzled, solitary, hardcore elite who, like, quote unquote, I don't need people, right? Like, I don't need to be around people. I don't want to be around people. And it seems like to that image or to that person, if you're trying to make that your narrative of your life that you want to believe, the author's just simply going to ask, well, how are you going to keep warm alone, right? Not like, do you need a personal heater, like a space heater, but literally like, what does it mean for you to then be comforted? What does it mean for you to find rest? What does it mean for you to find safety in the presence of others, right? There's a ministry, I love this term, but there's a ministry of presence that is so obviously part of the Christian walk, where we need each other so much in human form that like the incarnation makes so much sense when we look at it, right? Like the only way for God to bring some of the comfort that he brings, some portion of the comfort that he brings, was because he came in the flesh and dwelt among us. And we cannot do that on our, like, we just can't live life on our own. It's not an option. I guess it is an option, but it'll just be terrible. It'll just be a terrible life. Yeah. So being alone. So we have profit from being together. We have comfort from being together. And then we see verse 12, the last verse. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of three strands is not quickly broken. Here, I think it's communicating we have strength together and we have equality together, right? This one, I think, most hits on this theme we were talking about before, but the innate worshipfulness of human beings. The truth is, referring to this strand of three cords, there's nothing distinct about the cords. They're just the same cord, but they're woven together. Humans are simply just equal to one another in regards of how they relate to God. There's nothing like innately more or less special about any human beings. And part of the reason why it is idolatry to worship them is because they are then also so much equal to you and so much less than God, right? That's just the reality of it. But they are powerful enough that when they are knit together, right, like individual strands of rope, they somehow become more powerful. Like they're so much stronger than they were when they were alone. They have like this filled with strength that is able to then overcome the overpowering nature of an enemy. One is overpowered, but two get to defend themselves. Like they have each other's backs, right? And that is simply the nature of how humans work together. I don't know. Would you have anything to say about like the equality or the strength of humans being together, Stephen? If not, that's fine.
I'm gonna have a bunch. No, you keep going.
The last thing I was going to say in terms of our relationship and how this relates, I thought was interesting, is that in classic ancient interpretation of this threefold cord, many saw this as a reference to the Trinity, right? The three in one, the Godhead, which I think is actually really appropriate. And here's why. I believe that our cues for how to relate to one another as humans actually do come from the Trinity. I think that we're supposed to take them from the Trinity because they are in perfect relationship to one another. They are perfect peace with one another. They serve one another as equals. They have different functions that they both share and do separately. And because of their union together in equality, they are able to then pour out love on the world around them. There is no animosity in the Trinity. And in the same way, Jesus said in John 17, God, Father, make us one, and as an extension, make the church one, right? Make them one as we are one, is what he said. And that's like such a brain teaser. That's like such a like brain blast moment that's so hard to comprehend, that somehow, some way, the church is called to have the same level of relationship with one another that Jesus had with his Father. And in this serving, equality, self-denying, love outpouring, shame destroying, open relationship among equals. And I just think all I can really say, at least that's what I wrote, that's a big statement. Like that's, there's just a lot to unpack there that's really hard, and totally flies against any temptation we would have to treat our husband or wives like gods, to treat our children and orient our whole lives around our children, to find meaning in celebrities or athletes that we try to emulate. All of those things have a level of appropriateness in terms of how we relate to them, but they all very quickly go too far too fast, and we begin to enter into the realm of worship. And I think that is completely inappropriate, and actually does not allow us to be a strand of three chords, does not allow us to be strengthened by one another because we have decided not to be equals. You'll be your strand, I'll be my strand. I'll admire this other strand of rope and wish I were a better strand of rope. But the reality is you're the same strand of rope. Like nothing about that person, their celebrity, makes them more or less like God. Actually, it's just innate in them, and you are equals in every way. But we do not understand the world that way. It's very I think it's very difficult to understand the world that way. It is easy to be in awe of their celebrity.
Yeah. I think it even goes, in some ways, it's like a form of envy. I think we admire what's in other people, and maybe we either love them for it or hate them for it in unhealthy ways.
Totally.
A comment I have when you're commenting on how like one person cannot prevail against two, and the cord of three strands is not broken.
Yeah.
Then you were tying this image into the Trinity, and then how that the relationship that's in the midst of the Trinity is what Jesus hopes for the church. It just reminds me of, and I think Jesus says to Peter, like, you're the rock, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I think that's that same picture of like the body of Christ, the unity that Jesus imagined in his people would be so strong and empowered that the gates of hell would not be able to prevail. And I think you're right. There's a sense of strength there that I think we underestimate even.
No, that's really good. No, that's totally true. That's a really good thought. Because it is Satan's intention and his will that we do not treat human beings the way that we are supposed to, either too much in the realm of worship or too much in the realm of hatred. And that is just inappropriate.
Yeah, he knows his gates will be stormed if he does not disunify us.
Totally. So that's all that I think in terms of what this video and this content allows. We're going to have a great discussion unpacking this passage, and I think Philippians 2 to some degree on Sunday. I think we're going to ask some really good questions and delve into what does it mean to have relationship with one another. But here are just the big takeaways that I would, again, just to summarize this whole thing. 1, know this about yourself, be aware of it. Humans will always be tempted to find their meaning in something other than God. It's just part of the fall. It's difficult. You can fight it if you become aware of it. 2, humans then are also close enough to the divine that they are especially at times inspire worship of themselves, right? There's just something about them that's so great and so evil that we can begin to put undue emphasis and priority on them. And then 3, the way that we're called to relate to one another as opposed to that is to help profit one another as we work together, is to comfort one another as we go through hardships on the road, and to promote equality and strengthen one another as we are assailed, as like evil fights against us, like we have the ability to overcome it because of our strength that comes with us being together. There is no such thing as a cowboy Christian. There's no such thing as the myth of like the taekwondo master who beats up like 30 people by themselves because they're so cool. Like that makes for good movies, but really bad theology. You are not good enough on your own, no matter what. I'm sorry. That's just not the case, and it never will be. Even when the world was perfect in the Garden of Eden, God said, "It is not good for man to be alone." And that still applies even more so, I think, today.
Amen.
So that's what we have today. This is hopefully a pretty cursory take on relationships, and do they have meaning? The answer is yes, in the right way. Just like with everything we've been talking about in this series, everything does if you can learn to relate to them rightly. Otherwise, they do become meaningless, hebel, like a smoke cloud. But we're going to talk more about it on Sunday. I'm excited to spend that time with you guys. Stephen, do you have any final parting thoughts for us?
Lean into relationship in the healthiest of ways.
Amen. All right, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.